Please welcome to the stage Akiko Fujita of Yahoo Finance and Chris Sharrock of Microsoft.
Good morning to all of you. I'm Akiko Fujita. I'm an anchor over at Yahoo Finance. Very excited to be hosting this conversation with Chris Sharrock. Microsoft, one of those companies as a business journalist I've covered for many years, but we don't often get to talk about the work that you're doing over at the UN. And I think, a lot of people may not know how long Microsoft has been working with the UN. It's been about, 20 years? But you just established a physical presence there back in 2020. So I want to start the conversation there. What prompted Microsoft to take that extra step?
Well, look. First of all, it's fantastic to be back in presence with people in an audience and to be able to travel across the Atlantic, as you can tell from my accent that I have done. It's a very good question, Akiko. And I think it's important to look at it in the context of Microsoft's historical work. So exactly as you say, Microsoft has been working with and partnering with the United Nations for decades, actually. And it's not necessarily a sudden step that's been taken. It's more a natural evolution of the deepening of that partnership and a growing understanding and appreciation of the contribution that we might be able to play that took us to the point that we established the office as we did in 2020. So we have a team, which I'm honored to lead, that is the UN and international organizations team. We have an office here in New York, close to the UN, which we are able to use. Very, very lucky to be able to use it to convene, to bring people together in dialogue. We also have people working in Geneva, in Washington, DC, and in Paris. So we're engaging with the broader international system as well. And so once you've established that physical, permanent presence, of course it's great to be able to use it for events like we have now. UNGA, everyone descends on New York. For UNGA, we all come and we have the great discussions and the important discussions that we do. But it also means that we're here all year round, so we can really deepen those conversations and really, have a substantive conversation that persists.
I know you're fairly new in this particular role. You've been with Microsoft for about a year or so. Talk me through the thinking, though, within the company when you decided to establish the presence at the UN. How much of this was about leveraging, Microsoft's technology to help the UN accelerate digitization through the organization? How much of it was about using Microsoft's technology to try and solve some of the issues the UN set out to?
Well, that's clearly a part of it. Digital technology, as we see, is capable of transformative solutions. So there are clearly ways in which Microsoft technology can be supportive. The data hub that we set up with the World Health Organization, for example. But there's more to it than that, and we have to always approach problems and challenges of the scale that the world currently faces. We have to approach them with humility, and it's clearly going to require a multi-stakeholder approach to try and find solutions to some of these problems. So yes, definitely, Microsoft and our technology can be part of the solution to some of the challenges, and we can talk maybe about the SDGs in a minute. But every sector has a role to play, and it's really the partnership that we want to try and build as well. So the private sector can clearly bring the agility that it's known for, but then if you have a civil society at the table as well, you can have a depth in the conversation, and then of course, you need the public sector to have the breadth and the width to actually move forward in action. So there's really a multi-stakeholder approach at the heart of our thinking, and you'll see that in a lot of the projects that we particularly engage with.
Let's talk about the SDGs, of course, Sustainable Development Goals. These are goals that UN countries set out to achieve by 2030 back in 2015. How has Microsoft helped advance some of those goals?
Okay, so just as you say, we have the Sustainable Development Goals established. We're halfway through the process of trying to deliver them. They have been agreed. They do make up the common global agenda. If you're going to engage with the UN, then it's entirely right and proper that you engage with the SDGs. And we publish a report every year that sets out where we as a company are contributing to the SDGs. There's clearly a role for technology in trying to move them forward as well. But there's again, I come back to the question of a multi-stakeholder approach, and how can we, in a deep way over the course of several years, how can we engage and how can we support? And there's one process that I'd particularly like to draw your attention to. So if you say that you're going to support the SDGs and you're going to drive them forward, then you have to engage with those who are furthest behind in terms of trying to meet them. And so you have to engage with the least developed countries and those who are most in need of support. So there is a conference which is taking place in March next year in Qatar, which is the fifth conference of the least developed countries, LDC 5. Microsoft has agreed to chair the private sector track of that forum. So we will be preparing the discussions that will be taking place in Qatar, bringing together private sector partners, not only to think about technology and the challenges of connectivity, which are absolutely at the root of trying to plug the LDCs into the modern economy, but also looking at issues around agriculture and climate and energy, and of course finance, which is the foundational challenge that they face. And just to say a little bit about the connectivity piece, it can't be overstated really how important that is and how transformative progress could be if we can move forward. There are something like 2.7 billion people who are unconnected to the internet, and 96% of those are in the least developed countries. So if we can start to make some progress on connectivity, then you could really see that transformative solution kind of being arrived at. The connectivity to the internet is part of it, the physical connectivity, the wires, the plumbing, but then you also need to have the skills that allow people both to use the technology, but also to engage with the jobs that are made available through the digital transformation. So we're working on both of those, particularly in LDC 5.
I've heard you refer to the multi-stakeholder approach many times, and I know that's sort of the focus with which Microsoft has approached this partnership with the UN. There's a number of issues on the table, climate change being one of them, gender equality is another one, food security. What does that multi-stakeholder approach look like when you're tackling those issues?
Well, it's a good question. Let me take climate change as an example. So last year we were part of a group that established itself around something called the Carbon Call. And this is trying to address the challenge of accounting for emissions, measuring emissions so that you can then account for them. And maybe not the most exciting issue, but absolutely foundational. As a company, we've made commitments to be carbon negative by 2030. If we don't find a way to get the right data up to date in a way that we can look at, then we're not going to be able to track how we're doing on that. And this is a problem which is faced across sectors. You've got companies and all parts of society making these commitments to quite rightly become carbon neutral or carbon negative. If we don't address the underlying issue of accounting for these things, then we're not going to do it. So we come together in a multi-stakeholder approach around a call. We pool our efforts and we try and move forward. And this is very similar to the model of the Paris call that you will remember from the Paris Peace Forum. It's similar to the model of the Christchurch call, and we saw the summit of the Christchurch call yesterday in New York. So it's becoming quite a well-established model that we really think can shift the dial on a few of these issues.
Let's talk about your background a bit, because as we said, you've been with Microsoft for about a year, but prior to that, you've got a long history in government in the UK. And I wonder, when you think about now being on the private sector side, trying to tackle probably a lot of issues that you looked at in government, how do you see that role breaking down, and how do you draw on your past experiences to try and tackle some of these issues?
Well, it's not that long a history, Akiko. I'm not that old, but I spent about 20 years working in the UK government as a civil servant, mainly in the Treasury, but then 5.5 years as the UK ambassador at the OECD. which is in Paris, for those of you that don't know. And of course, when you're trying to design policy in the private sector, what do you need to design policy which is sensible and which will endure and function and deliver what you want to deliver? You need the evidence base, and you go through consultations. And so it is quite normal for me to conceive of the private sector, having input to the policy-making process. And when I was at the OECD, I think it's celebrating the 60th anniversary this year of the formation of the business group, BIAC at the OECD, or business at the OECD. And business has had a seat at the table in the OECD for 60 years to voice the business perspective, to feed in evidence and input and expert views. It is entirely normal in that context to do that. And so it doesn't feel strange to me to be taking the voice of business in some of those discussions. And I know from my experience just how much substantively business can add to the conversations that we need to have. And I think that's perhaps particularly the case where issues are moving fast and where there's a perspective that is needed from the experts that are at the frontier on technology, for example.
Does it feel like the role of the private sector has increased even more? I mean, some would argue that if you look at something like climate, for example, these policies can shift from administration to administration, whether that's in the US or whether that's in Europe. Businesses in many ways have tried to keep that steady hand. Do you feel like the role of the private sector is increasing in trying to tackle some of these global issues?
I don't know. I mean, maybe the ambition is increasing sometimes, but there is. I mentioned BIAC before, 60 years old. For 60 years, business has been coming to the table at the OECD. The International Chambers of Commerce, even older, and they have they have permanent observer status at the United Nations. So, there are tried and tested mechanisms for business to input into these discussions. But you make a point, of course. I mean, it's debatable. Business, can take the long view, of course, over time. But I'd say that what's really fundamental is that we come together in a multi-stakeholder approach and share all of the perspectives that we have. No one perspective is going to find the right solution. We have to come together.
When you think about what you have done since 2020 in this partnership with the UN, the question is, number one, do other companies follow? But also, people see Microsoft, they know the business side. It's a long history as a software company, obviously a much broader tech company now. How does your mission at the UN tie in with the business mission for the company?
Well, look, the mission statement of Microsoft, the company, is to empower every individual and every organization on the planet to achieve more. So by coming to the United Nations and try and contribute to the delivery of the SDGs and these global debates, that is entirely consistent and supportive of the company's mission. And to your point about whether there are others following, I certainly hope so, because we're trying to convene a private sector track and the input of the broader private sector for the LDC5 conference next year. We do need others to come, and bring and put their shoulder to the wheel and join us in trying to move some of these solutions to these incredible challenges that the world faces to try and move them forward. So yes, I hope others are coming.
Finally, in the limited time we have, if we can bring the conversation back to SDGs. As you said, we are at the halfway point. You're one of the stakeholders, as you said, in trying to advance these goals. How optimistic are you that those goals can be reached by 2030? We've heard so much about the setbacks that have happened, especially as a result of COVID.
I'm always an optimist, and Brad Smith, who is our company president, is an SDG advocate. He's been appointed by the Secretary General to try and do this. So we, at the very highest level as a company, are trying to do what we can. I think data, technology, we can support this effort. I look at it differently. There is still 7 years to go. Let's do what we can in these 7 years, and let's be optimistic.
We'll leave it on that positive note. Chris, thank you so much, and thank you all for joining in on the conversation.
Thanks, Akiko.